"Look at this guy. He can barely walk to the parking lot," laughed 17-year-old Jake, as Frank Morrison limped past the senior locker bay. "What's he gonna do if something real happens here?" His friends snickered as the old security guard continued his rounds, saying nothing, just doing his job like he had every day for 3 years. None of them realized they were looking at a man who'd earned 2 Purple Hearts and a Silver Star. And in exactly 47 minutes, Jake would owe his life to the man he just mocked. I wonder where you're watching this story unfold from today. Whether you're in a bustling city like New York or a quiet suburb in Ohio, you've probably witnessed someone being underestimated before. But rarely does the revelation come at such a critical moment, when lives hang in the balance and heroes emerge from the most unexpected places. Frank Morrison had always been a man of few words. At 67, his weathered hands and deliberate movements told stories he never shared. He lived in a modest one-bedroom apartment on Maple Street, the kind with thin walls and a view of the community center parking lot. It wasn't much, but it was enough for a man who'd learned to find peace in simplicity. The job at Riverside High School was supposed to be retirement work, something to keep him busy and help pay the bills. When Principal Martinez hired him 3 years ago, she'd barely glanced at his resume. Security experience was all she cared about, never asking what that experience entailed. Frank hadn't volunteered the details either. What she didn't know was that Frank Morrison's security experience included 22 years as a Force Recon Marine, with deployments in Somalia, Iraq, and Afghanistan. His service record, buried in classified files, told the story of a man who'd led rescue operations under fire, planned tactical interventions in hostile territory, and saved more lives than most people could count. The 2 Purple Hearts sat in a wooden box in his bedroom closet, next to his Silver Star and Combat Action Ribbon. He'd earned them in places whose names couldn't be printed in newspapers, during operations that officially never happened. But Frank had made a conscious choice when he hung up his uniform. He wanted to be just another civilian, living quietly without the weight of old wars following him around. The limp in his left leg came from shrapnel and Fallujah. A roadside bomb had flipped his Humvee, killing his driver and leaving Frank with metal fragments that still set off airport security scanners. The doctors had done their best, but some wounds never fully heal. Frank adapted as Marines do, and carried on without complaint. His colleagues at Riverside High knew none of this. To them, he was just the old guy who checked student IDs at the front entrance, walked slow patrols through the hallways, and kept to himself during lunch breaks. He never joined the faculty meetings or after-school events. He came in at 7 a.m., worked his 8 hours, and went home to his quiet apartment. Riverside High School served 2,100 students in suburban Denver, Colorado. Built in the 1980s, it was a sprawling single-story campus with multiple buildings connected by covered walkways. The main building housed the administrative offices, library, and most classrooms. The gymnasium and cafeteria occupied separate structures, while portable classrooms dotted the perimeter for overflow capacity. Frank's security station was positioned near the main entrance, a small glass-walled office that gave him a clear view of the front doors and main hallway. His daily routine included checking visitors, monitoring the metal detectors, and conducting regular walks through all areas of the campus. It was methodical work that reminded him of military patrol duties, though the stakes seemed infinitely lower. The students barely noticed him most days. He was part of the background, like the janitors or the lunch ladies, present but invisible to teenage eyes focused on their own concern. This invisibility had become Frank's preferred state of existence. After decades of high-stress combat situations, the routine predictability of school security felt like a gift. Principal Martinez ran a tight ship, or at least she tried to. Riverside High had the usual problems: occasional fights, vaping in the bathrooms, kids cutting class. Nothing that required more than standard disciplinary procedure. The most excitement Frank usually encountered was breaking up arguments in the parking lot or escorting disruptive students to the office. But Frank's trained eye noticed things others missed. He observed patterns in student behavior, identified potential trouble spots, and quietly adjusted his patrol routes accordingly. His military experience had taught him that preventing problems was always better than reacting to them. The mockery had started early in Frank's second year at Riverside High. It began with whispered comments about his age, his limp, his obvious discomfort with the school's high-tech security systems. The kids weren't malicious, necessarily. They were just teenagers who saw an old man struggling with tablets and keycards when they could navigate complex video games with their eyes closed. Jake Stevens was 17, a star linebacker with college scouts calling and a confidence that bordered on arrogance. He wasn't a bad kid, but he had the teenager's certainty that anyone over 40 was basically useless. When Frank would slowly make his rounds through the athletic wing, Jake and his teammates would exchange glances and barely suppress their amusement. "Bet he takes 5 minutes just to get up from his chair," Marcus had joked one day as they watched Frank laboriously stand up from his security desk. "My grandpa moves faster than him and he's got a walker," added Tyler, earning laughs from the group. Frank heard it all, of course. His hearing was still sharp despite his age, and years of military service had taught him to be aware of his surroundings at all times. But he never responded. Never let his expression change. He'd learned long ago that sometimes the best response was no response at all. The faculty wasn't much better. During a staff meeting about campus security protocols, Vice Principal Johnson had suggested that maybe they needed someone a bit more agile for the position. The comment had been made quietly, but Frank was standing right outside the conference room door, adjusting the bulletin board displays as he did every Tuesday afternoon. Even Principal Martinez had her doubt. She'd inherited Frank when she took over the school, and while he was reliable and punctual, she sometimes wondered if they needed someone who could respond more quickly to potential emergencies. The district had been pressuring all schools to upgrade their security measures, and Frank's obvious physical limitations were becoming harder to ignore. What none of them understood was that Frank's apparent limitations were actually carefully managed adaptation. His slow movements weren't just due to age and injury. They were the result of constant situational awareness. Frank didn't walk slowly because he couldn't move faster. He walked slowly because he was always scanning, always processing, always ready. The limp that the kids mocked was accompanied by perfect balance and core strength that most 20-year-olds couldn't match. The hands that seemed to fumble with technology could still field strip a rifle in complete darkness. The old man they dismissed as harmless had reflexes that 20 years of civilian life hadn't dulled. 3 weeks before the incident, Frank noticed the first sign. It was subtle, a change in routine that most people would have missed entirely. A silver Honda Civic had been parked across the street from the school 3 different mornings. Always in the same spot, always with a lone occupant who never got out. Frank had developed the habit of noting vehicle patterns during his years in combat zones, where a car parked in the wrong place at the wrong time could signal an improvised explosive device or an ambush. The civilian world didn't require such hypervigilance, but old habits died hard. He began timing his morning patrols to get a better look at the Honda. The driver appeared to be a young man, early 20s, wearing dark clothing and a baseball cap pulled low. He never seemed to be waiting for anyone or doing anything specific, just sitting there watching the school. Frank made discreet inquiries. The car didn't belong to any school employee or regular volunteer. No construction or maintenance work was scheduled that would require surveillance of the campus, and the driver's behavior, sitting alone for exactly 30 minutes each morning before driving away, suggested something more purposeful than casual observation. The second sign came during lunch period on a Thursday. Frank was conducting his usual cafeteria walk when he noticed a young man standing at the fence line near the student parking lot. He wasn't a student or faculty member. Frank knew everyone who belonged on campus. The man was taking pictures with his phone, apparently capturing images of the building layout and security camera positions. When Frank approached to investigate, the photographer quickly left, but not before Frank got a good look at his face. The same person from the Honda Civic. Frank reported both incidents to Principal Martinez, but his concerns were dismissed with bureaucratic politeness. The school dealt with complaints about photographers and suspicious vehicles every week. Usually parents worried about their teenagers or private investigators working divorce cases. Without more concrete evidence of a threat, there wasn't much the administration could do. The third sign was digital. Frank wasn't particularly tech-savvy, but his granddaughter had taught him enough about social media to monitor potential threats. A routine check of local hashtags and location tags turned up concerning posts from an account that didn't appear to belong to any current student. The posts contained angry rants about society, frequent references to violence as a solution to personal problems, and several images of firearms. More troubling were the specific mentions of Riverside High School and veiled threats about making them all pay attention. Frank printed the posts and brought them to the administration office. This time, Principal Martinez took his concerns more seriously, but the process of involving law enforcement and investigating online threats moved slowly through official channels. In Frank's experience, threats had a way of materializing faster than bureaucratic responses. 2 days before the attack, Frank's military instincts went into full alert mode. The Honda Civic was back, but this time the driver got out and walked the perimeter of the school grounds during lunch period. Frank watched from his office as the young man, now confirmed to be the same person from the photos and social media posts, methodically examined entry points, camera blind spots, and potential escape routes. This wasn't casual reconnaissance anymore. This was operational planning. Frank immediately called Principal Martinez, but she was in a district meeting. Vice Principal Johnson took the call and promised to look into it, but Frank could hear the skepticism in his voice. To the administration, Frank was still the old security guard who worried too much and moved too slowly. That afternoon, Frank made a decision that went against every official protocol but aligned perfectly with his military training. He began his own tactical preparation. He studied the school's layout with fresh eyes, identifying potential ambush points, choke points, and safe evacuation routes. He mentally rehearsed response scenarios, considering variables like time of day, crowd density, and probable attack vectors. He couldn't carry a weapon on school grounds. District policy was clear on that point, but he could position himself strategically and prepare contingency plans. Frank also reached out to a contact from his Marine Corps days, now working in federal law enforcement. Without revealing specific details, he inquired about the proper protocols for reporting potential threats when local authorities were unresponsive. The conversation confirmed his suspicions. Sometimes you have to act on incomplete information to prevent complete catastrophe. The night before the attack, Frank couldn't sleep. His combat experience had taught him to trust his instincts, and every instinct was screaming that something bad was coming. He spent the dark hours reviewing everything he knew about the threat, planning his response, and accepting that tomorrow might require him to become someone he'd tried very hard to leave behind. Tuesday morning started like any other. Frank arrived at 6:45 a.m., 30 minutes before his shift officially began. He liked the quiet time to walk the campus, check that everything was secure, and mentally prepare for the day ahead. The janitors were finishing their overnight work, and a few early arriving teachers were setting up their classrooms. Frank's morning patrol revealed nothing unusual. The parking lots were empty except for faculty vehicles, the building perimeters were clear, and all security systems were functioning normally. But the absence of obvious threats did nothing to ease the tension he'd been carrying for days. By 7:30 a.m., students began arriving for zero-period classes and morning activities. Frank took his position at the main entrance, checking IDs and monitoring the metal detectors. The routine interactions with students and staff helped calm his nerves slightly, but he remained hyper-alert to anything out of place. At 8:15 a.m., the Honda Civic drove slowly past the school's main entrance. Frank couldn't see the driver clearly through the tinted windows, but the vehicle's presence confirmed his worst suspicions. The reconnaissance phase was over. Today was operational. Frank discreetly activated the panic button under his desk, sending a silent alarm to local law enforcement. But he knew from experience that police response times varied, and the next few minutes might be critical. He also sent a text message to Principal Martinez, potential threat on campus, initiating lockdown procedures. At 8:27 a.m., Frank noticed a young man walking across the student parking lot carrying a large duffel bag. The individual matched the description of the person he'd been tracking, but was wearing different clothing and a hood that partially obscured his face. More importantly, the bag appeared heavy and was being carried in a way that suggested it contained something other than school supplies. Frank knew he had to make a choice: follow official protocol and wait for confirmation from administration, or trust his instincts and take immediate action. 22 years of military service had taught him that hesitation kills, and his gut told him that lives were about to be at risk. He quietly left his security station and began moving toward an intercept position. At exactly 2:47 p.m., the first shots rang out. Frank had spent the day positioning himself strategically, staying mobile and maintaining visual contact with potential entry points. When classes changed at 2:40 p.m., he'd moved to the main hallway intersection, where he could observe multiple corridors simultaneously. The gunfire erupted from the east wing, near the science classrooms. Frank immediately recognized the sound: semi-automatic rifle fire, multiple shots in rapid succession. The acoustics of the building made it difficult to pinpoint the exact location, but the general direction was clear. Students in the main hallway began screaming and running in all directions. Some dropped to the floor, others pressed themselves against lockers, and many simply froze in terror. Teachers emerged from their classrooms, trying to understand what was happening and whether they should evacuate or shelter in place. Frank's training kicked in automatically. While everyone else was reacting to the chaos, he was already moving with purpose. His limp disappeared as adrenaline overrode the chronic pain in his leg. His movements became fluid and precise, muscle memory taking over from conscious thought. "Get down! Everyone get down!" Frank shouted, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in crisis situations. "Teachers, lock your doors. Students, move away from windows." His commands cut through the panic. Students who had been running aimlessly suddenly had direction. Teachers who had been standing confused immediately began securing their classrooms. In seconds, the chaotic evacuation became an organized response. Frank pulled out his radio and contacted the main office. "This is Morrison, active shooter in the East Wing. Initiating emergency lockdown. Contact law enforcement immediately." But Frank wasn't waiting for law enforcement. He was already moving toward the sound of gunfire. Frank advanced through the East Wing using techniques he'd learned in urban combat training. He moved along walls, checked corners carefully, and used reflective surfaces to see around obstacles before exposing himself. The muscle memory was still there after all these years. His body remembered how to move through hostile territory, even when his mind was focused on the immediate threat. The shooting had stopped temporarily, but Frank could hear the gunmen moving through classrooms, apparently searching for specific targets or trying to breach locked doors. The brief pause in gunfire gave Frank hope that he might be able to intercept before more damage was done. As he rounded the corner near the chemistry lab, Frank saw him, a young man in dark clothing, carrying a semi-automatic rifle and moving methodically from door to door. The shooter appeared to be in his early 20s, exactly matching Frank's observations from the previous week. This wasn't a random act of violence, it was the culmination of careful planning. Frank was approximately 30 yards away, with clear line of sight but no cover between his position and the gunman. In his military days, he would have had a weapon and tactical support. Here he had only his experience and the element of surprise. The shooter was focused on trying to force open a classroom door where students and a teacher had barricaded themselves inside. Frank could hear muffled crying and shouting from behind the door, and he knew that if the gunman succeeded in breaching that room, multiple people would die. Frank made his decision. "Stop! Security!" Frank shouted, deliberately drawing the shooter's attention away from the classroom door. The gunman spun around, bringing his rifle to bear on Frank's position. For a moment the two men stared at each other across the empty hallway, the young shooter with his face twisted by rage and confusion, and the old security guard standing calmly with his hands visible and empty. "Put the weapon down, son," Frank said, his voice steady and authoritative. "It's over. Law enforcement is on the way. Don't make this worse than it already is." The shooter's response was to raise his rifle and aim directly at Frank's chest. What happened next would be debated in incident reports and expert analyses for months afterward. Frank Morrison, 67-year-old security guard with a pronounced limp and no apparent combat training, somehow closed a 30-yard gap and disarmed an active shooter in approximately 4 seconds. The official law enforcement report would describe it as an extraordinary tactical intervention by security personnel with apparent advanced training. Witness statements from students who had seen portions of the confrontation through classroom door windows described Frank moving like a different person entirely. The truth was simpler and more complex than anyone imagined. When the shooter aimed his rifle at Frank, 22 years of Marine Corps training compressed into a single moment of absolute clarity. Frank's body moved before his conscious mind could register the movement. A combat roll to the right that took him out of the rifle's line of fire, followed by a sprint that covered 30 yards faster than any 67-year-old should have been able to move. The shooter tried to track Frank's movement, but by the time he had adjusted his aim, Frank was already inside the rifle's effective range. A textbook disarmament technique, taught to Marines for close-quarters combat, separated the weapon from the shooter's hands and sent it clattering across the linoleum floor. The young man tried to resist, but he was dealing with someone who had spent 2 decades learning how to neutralize threats. Frank's restraint techniques were precise and effective, designed to immobilize without causing permanent injury. Within seconds, the shooter was face down on the floor with his hands secured behind his back. "Stay down," Frank said quietly, his knee pressed against the young man's back. "It's over." The entire confrontation had lasted less than 30 seconds. From the moment Frank first shouted until the shooter was neutralized, the school's security cameras recorded an event that would be studied in law enforcement training academies for years to come. Police arrived 4 minutes after Frank's initial panic button activation, expecting to find an active shooter situation in progress. Instead, they found Frank Morrison sitting calmly beside a subdued suspect, the confiscated rifle safely secured 10 feet away. "Situation contained," Frank reported as the first officers entered the hallway. "One perpetrator in custody. No shots fired in approximately 6 minutes. Medical may be needed for minor injuries during the takedown." The lead officer, Sergeant Patricia Williams, had 20 years of experience with crisis situations. She'd never seen anything quite like this. An elderly security guard who had single-handedly resolved an active shooter incident with no fatalities and minimal property damage. "Sir, I need to ask you to step back while we secure the scene," Sergeant Williams said. "Are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" Frank slowly stood up, and his limp returned as the adrenaline began to fade. "I'm fine." The suspect may have some bruising on his wrists, and possibly a minor abrasion on his cheek, but nothing serious. "The weapon is secured and I don't believe there are any additional threats." As paramedics and additional officers flooded the scene, Frank quietly provided a detailed briefing on everything he'd observed during the incident. His report was precise, chronological, and included tactical details that impressed the veteran law enforcement personnel. Principal Martinez arrived as the suspect was being loaded into an ambulance for medical clearance before booking. She stared at Frank in disbelief, struggling to reconcile the elderly man she'd barely noticed for 3 years with the person who had just saved her school. "Frank," she said, her voice shaky with emotion and exhaustion, "I don't understand. What just happened here?" Frank looked at her calmly, his weathered hands steady as he adjusted his security badge. "Just doing my job, ma'am." The FBI investigation that followed revealed the full scope of the planned attack. The shooter, identified as Michael Torres, had been planning the assault for over 2 months. His seized computer contained detailed maps of the school, student schedules, and a manifesto outlining his intention to make them all pay attention to his various grievances. Torres had legally purchased his rifle and ammunition 3 weeks before the attack. His social media posts, which Frank had attempted to report, showed a clear escalation of violent ideation and specific threats against Riverside High School. The failure of various systems to recognize and respond to these warning signs would become the subject of multiple investigations and policy reviews. More disturbing was Torres's detailed knowledge of the school's security procedures and staff capabilities. His planning documents showed that he had specifically chosen Riverside High because he believed its security measures were inadequate and its personnel were unprepared for a serious threat. "Subject appears to have underestimated capabilities of on-site security personnel," read one line in the FBI's preliminary report. That would prove to be one of the greatest understatements in law enforcement history. The investigation also revealed Frank Morrison's full military background, information that had been omitted from his employment application and never discovered during the school's cursory background check. When FBI agents accessed his service record, they found a career that read like a military thriller. Force Recon Marine, 1975-1997. Multiple combat deployments, expert marksman, hand-to-hand combat instructor. 2 Purple Hearts, Silver Star, Bronze Star with Valor, Combat Action Ribbon. Specialized training in counterterrorism, urban warfare and hostage rescue operations. Security clearance level, top secret. "Why didn't you tell anyone about your background?" Agent Sarah Chen asked during Frank's debriefing. Frank shrugged slightly. "Didn't seem relevant. I was hired to check student IDs and walk around the building. That's what I did." Within hours of the incident, news crews arrived at Riverside High School. The story of an elderly security guard stopping a school shooter was exactly the kind of narrative that captured national attention, except that most of the initial reports got the story completely wrong. Early news broadcasts described Frank as a brave civilian who risked his life to protect students, and a retired grandfather whose quick thinking saved the day. The emphasis was on his age and apparent physical limitations, playing up the David versus Goliath angle that made for compelling television. It wasn't until the FBI released limited details about Frank's military background that the story began to change. Suddenly, reporters were describing him as a decorated combat veteran, and a trained professional with specialized skills. The narrative shifted from unlikely hero to hidden warrior. But the most dramatic revelation came during a televised interview with Jake Stevens, the student who had mocked Frank just hours before the attack. "I called him slow," Jake said, tears visible in his eyes. "I made fun of the way he walked. Me and my friends, we thought he was just some old man who couldn't do anything. And then he saved my life. He saved all our lives." The interview was broadcast nationally and went viral within hours. Social media exploded with discussions about hidden heroes, the value of experience, and the danger of judging people by appearances. Jake's mother contacted the school administration requesting a meeting with Frank to personally thank him. Other parents followed suit. Within days, Frank had received hundreds of thank you cards, flowers, and requests for interviews from media outlets across the country. Frank declined all interview requests and asked the school to forward the thank you notes to local veteran organizations. He didn't want attention or recognition. He just wanted to go back to his quiet job and his quiet life. Despite Frank's reluctance to seek attention, recognition found him anyway. The Marine Corps reached out to inform him that his actions had brought honor to the service and that his former commanding officers were proud of his continued dedication to protecting others. The Denver Police Department presented him with a civilian commendation for bravery. The Colorado State Legislature passed a resolution honoring his service to both the military and his community. The National Association of School Security Professionals invited him to speak at their annual conference. Frank accepted the honors graciously, but briefly, always redirecting attention to the importance of proper training and preparedness rather than his individual actions. More meaningful to Frank was the change in atmosphere at Riverside High School. Students who had never noticed him before now greeted him by name in the hallways. Teachers included him in faculty discussions about security improvements. Principal Martinez consulted him regularly on policy decisions and emergency preparedness. Jake Stevens, the student who had mocked him, became one of Frank's strongest advocates. Jake organized a student appreciation event and convinced the school board to install a small plaque near the main entrance, recognizing Frank's service to the school community. The plaque read simply, "In appreciation of Frank Morrison, whose dedication to protecting others exemplifies the best of the human spirit." Frank never said much about the plaque, but colleagues noticed that he always paused to straighten it slightly during his morning round. 6 months after the incident, Riverside High School had become a model for school security. Best practices. Frank worked with administrators to improve threat assessment procedures, enhance communication protocols, and develop more effective emergency response plans. His recommendations were based on practical experience rather than theoretical knowledge. He understood the difference between security measures that looked impressive on paper and those that actually worked when lives were at stake. Frank also began mentoring other school security personnel, sharing techniques for observation, threat recognition, and crisis response. His daring sessions were always practical and focused on real-world applications rather than dramatic scenarios. "Most threats never escalate to violence," he would tell new security guards. "Your job is to notice problems early and address them before they become crises. The day you have to fight is the day something else went wrong." The shooting incident led to broader discussions about veteran employment in schools and the untapped potential of experienced personnel in civilian security roles. Several school districts began specifically recruiting former military personnel for security positions, recognizing that their training and experience were invaluable assets. Frank remained at Riverside High School, turning down offers from larger districts and private security companies. When asked why he stayed, his answer was characteristically simple: "I know this place. These kids. This is where I belong." 1 year after the incident, a local newspaper reporter asked Frank if he ever thought about what might have happened if he hadn't been there that day. Frank was quiet for a long moment, looking out across the student parking lot where normal teenage life continued to unfold. "You can't think about what ifs," he finally said. "You just do what needs doing when it needs doing." The reporter pressed for more details about his military background, his tactical training, the specific techniques he'd used to stop the shooter. "That's not the important part," Frank replied. "The important part is that everyone went home safe that day. Students, teachers, staff. Everybody got to see their families again. That's what matters." As the interview concluded, Jake Stevens appeared in the hallway, now a senior preparing for graduation. He waved at Frank with obvious affection and respect. "That kid used to make fun of me," Frank told the reporter, a slight smile crossing his weathered face. Now he's talking about joining the Marines after graduation. Says he wants to learn how to protect people like I do. Frank paused, watching Jake disappear around the corner with his friend. Maybe that's the real victory. Not stopping one bad thing from happening, but inspiring good things to happen for years to come. The reporter later wrote that Frank Morrison represented something increasingly rare in modern America, a genuine hero who didn't want to be famous for his heroism. His story resonated not because it was extraordinary, but because it reminded people that extraordinary courage often comes from ordinary places. Some of the most powerful people in our communities are the ones we barely notice: the security guards, the janitors, the maintenance workers who keep our institutions running safely and smoothly. They carry their own stories, their own experiences, their own capabilities that may only be revealed when everything depends on them. Frank Morrison had been protecting people his entire adult life. For 22 years he'd done it in uniform, in places where everyone understood the danger and the stakes. For 3 years he'd done it in civilian clothes, in a place where most people thought the danger was theoretical. In the end, the uniform didn't matter. The recognition didn't matter. What mattered was that when the moment came, when lives hung in the balance and someone had to act, Frank Morrison was ready. Today, Frank Morrison continues his quiet service at Riverside High School. He still arrives early, still walks his methodical patrols, still checks student IDs with the same careful attention to detail. The only difference is that now, when students see him in the hallway, they don't see just an old security guard. They see someone who proved that heroes don't always look like what we expect them to look like. They see someone who showed that experience and dedication matter more than youth and appearance. They see someone who taught them that the most powerful thing you can do is the right thing, regardless of whether anyone notices or appreciates it. Frank's story reminds us that across America, in schools and offices and neighborhoods everywhere, there are quiet protectors whose real stories we may never know. Veterans working civilian jobs, experienced professionals in humble positions, trained individuals who've chosen service over recognition. They're checking our IDs, securing our buildings, and keeping us safe in ways we don't even realize. And someday, when everything depends on their training and their courage, they'll be ready to do what Frank Morrison did: step forward when others step back, act when others freeze, and protect when others need protection. The next time you see someone like Frank, someone older, someone limping, someone who doesn't fit your idea of what strength looks like, remember that some of the most capable people are those who've learned not to advertise their capability. Sometimes the person everyone underestimates is exactly the person everyone needs. Where are you watching from today? Have you ever met someone like Frank Morrison, someone whose real story was hidden behind a humble exterior? Share their memory in the comments below, because heroes like Frank deserve to be remembered, whether they seek recognition or not. And if this story reminded you that courage comes in unexpected forms, subscribe to Security Story. We're here to honor the quiet guardians who keep us safe, one story at a time.